This is Dr. Stephen Schuler, and today I want to talk about how to write an essay and about why it matters. Now, before we talk about how to write an essay, I want to begin with a much more basic question. Why would you write an essay? Now, if you're in school, there's really only one reason to write an essay, and that's to get a grade. That's almost the only reason a student would ever sit down to write an essay in the first place. But why do you have to write an essay to get a grade? Well, it's to demonstrate your knowledge and your ability to think through a problem. It's one way that you can show your work, as the math teachers say. It's how you show a teacher that you understand a subject well enough to do some analytical thinking or some creative thinking about it. But consider the fact that a lot of people who write essays and things like them write them even when nobody's making them do it. I mean, all editorials and op-ed pieces, as well as a lot of blog posts, are essays. Not only do people write these essays of their own free will, but sometimes people will even pay good money to read them. So we have to think about, why might a person choose to write anything at all? I mean, why write something rather than nothing? And I can think of two answers. The first reason we might write an essay is that we want to clarify our thinking. We want to put some vague impressions into concrete words and statements and figure out what we're really thinking about something. Or we might be just trying to figure out whether what we do think is really valid. In other words, we write to discover something. And we do this mostly when we're writing for ourselves. Now, the other reason that we might write an essay is to try to answer a question, and especially to persuade people to take a side in a controversy. And this is the kind of essay that we write primarily for other people to read. Now, the word essay itself is linked to both of these purposes. An essay is an attempt. If you know your French, you know the verb essayer, to try or to attempt something. And an essay can be an attempt to understand something, and it can be an attempt to persuade somebody that your understanding is correct. And at its best, the essay is going to do both of these things. But before you can even begin to write about an issue, there are two things that have to be true of you. First of all, you have to be motivated, and secondly, you have to have some knowledge. I want to talk about the first one first, motivation. In other words, you need to have a genuine interest in the issue or topic that you're going to write about. And I think a lot of people who can't seem to write aren't really bad at writing. They fail at writing because they're not really interested in any of the topics that are available to them. If an issue seems really important to you, you might well decide to respond in writing to it all on your own. And that's an ideal situation. In school, you usually have to decide that you're going to be interested enough in something that doesn't normally interest you, at least enough that you can write something meaningful about it. Well, being interested in stuff is not automatic. It's a habit, I think, that is formed over a very long time, and I suspect that it's learned early on, probably in early childhood. But with enough motivation, you can learn to be interested in stuff, or at least interested enough to force your way through a writing assignment. And I should probably just add here that pretending to be interested in something that actually bores you is a really useful skill. I mean, you can get through a lot of boring meetings at work that way. Well, anyway, so you have to be motivated. You have to be interested in order to write well about anything. The other thing you have to have is not just interest, you have to have some knowledge about the issue. You have to actually know something, or you have to be willing to go and find out about it. And that means being willing to do a lot of reading and rereading, a lot of fact-finding and keeping track of where you got those facts. You have to go and gather a lot of information, and you have to be willing to gather a lot more information than will actually end up in the final draft of the essay. We'll talk about that more in a bit. So, because if everything goes into the if everything that you know about the topic goes into the essay, it's not going to be a very good essay because you won't know what you're leaving out. So anyway, before you even think about writing an essay, you have to be motivated and you have to know stuff about what you're writing about. And what I'm getting at here is that most people who say they can't write don't actually have a writing problem. They may not be great at putting sentences or paragraphs together, but there are some underlying problems that they need to deal with first before they ever get sentences and paragraphs on paper. They have a motivation problem, or they have a knowledge problem, or probably both. Because if you're not interested in a topic, you probably also don't know very much about it. People who fail to write essays or who fail to write good essays usually fail because of their lack of interest or their lack of knowledge on the topic. So let's assume that you are motivated to write something and that you do have at least enough knowledge about the issue to start writing about it. Where do you start? How do you start writing an essay? Starting is one of the hardest things to do. Well, the first question you have to ask yourself is, who are you writing this for anyway? I mean, who's going to read this once it's all finished? Is this just for yourself, or do you hope to reach somebody else with these ideas? Now, at times, you're going to have to stop and think about what your potential readers might already know about the topic, what they need to be reminded of. You're also going to have to think about what you definitely don't need to remind them of. I mean, do you have to define the technical terms that you're going to use? Do you have to explain the history of the issue? Will you have to explain why your idea is important at all? Or is everybody going to know as soon as you say it that it's an important issue? Or can you just plunge right into making a claim about the issue and just go from there? These are the kinds of questions that an experienced writer is going to ask himself or herself a lot. Now, thus far, all of this is taking place inside your own head, right? But at some point, you are going to have to start putting words on paper. You can't just write an essay just by thinking about it. I know I've tried, it doesn't work. Well, before we talk about how to write and where to start with, I want to talk about where you are doing your writing. If you're going to do your best work, your physical environment actually matters a lot. You need to do your writing in a physical setting that is conducive to the kinds of work that you're going to be doing. You need to be in a setting where you can have some good posture. People have a lot of personal preferences here. I find that I need to write sitting up straight in a chair that's not too comfortable, but comfortable enough that it doesn't distract me. Some people really like a standing desk. Other people like to sit on the floor or at a table. Really, whatever helps keep you focused. You also need quiet. Distracting noise makes it really hard to put your thoughts on paper. Now, white noise is okay. I sometimes use classical music, especially some Bach, to drown out some of the more distracting kinds of background noise. Earbuds are golden here. Whatever helps you stay focused and drown out or ignore the outside noises is great. You also need minimal interruptions. The biggest interruption you have is probably your phone. So silence your phone and put it on airplane mode if you dare. On your computer, you can disconnect the Wi-Fi even so you don't get notifications constantly. And also to prevent yourself getting on social media while you're supposed to be writing. I find that's a huge time drain for me when I'm supposed to be writing. So minimize all the interruptions. And then you need time. You need a place you can be at for a while. Because the longer you can go without an interruption or a distraction, the more efficiently you're going to work. Even 30 minutes of focused writing time can be very, very productive once you get into it. But some people, like me, write better early in the morning when the brain is fresh and rested. Other people write better late at night when fatigue has sort of lowered their inhibitions a little bit and they can put down words without being too self-critical. You'll figure out pretty quickly what works best for you. So let's get back to the writing task itself. Where do you start? Well, normally you write to make a point, right? You're trying to say something. You have a target or a goal that you're aiming for, even if that target is just to satisfy some arbitrary school assignment. So, so many pages, so many words, so many secondary sources, yada, yada, yada. So, should you begin with that end, that target, that goal in mind? I would say only vaguely and generally. If the essay has to be 1,000 words with an introduction, a thesis, a body paragraph, a conclusion, which one of those do you start with? Well, the answer is that you don't start with any of those. You don't start with an introduction or a conclusion. You don't start with body paragraphs. You don't even start with a thesis statement. What you start with is a topic. You start with an idea, though. You start with a question. And then you begin to gather information. You try to answer that question or find out what questions are out there, what answers are out there, what further questions are out there. And you usually do this by doing a lot of reading and a lot of rereading. People who don't read also tend not to write very well. Writing always grows out of thorough reading. So you do a lot of reading, you do a lot of taking notes, you do a lot of looking for connections and patterns in the data that you're gathering. If you're writing some kind of analysis, like a literary analysis, you reread the passage that you're going to analyze, and you do that several times. You mark it up and you make notes. Now at this stage, you might even have an opinion about what it all means. Now scientists call this a hypothesis. So you write that down. You write down your hypothesis. Actually, you should write down 3 or 4 different versions of your hypothesis and just keep that at the top of your document. It's probably going to get modified somewhat or maybe a lot as you write. That's okay. You just need an idea there to start with. So you start with a hypothesis, and it might just be a question. Now, this process of gathering information takes time. For a short essay, let's say something that's going to come in at about 3 to 5 pages, this is easily a 2-day process if you figure on spending a couple hours a day just gathering information. For a longer essay, the 8, 10, 12-page term paper project, you're going to need at least a week if you plan on working a couple hours a day on gathering the necessary information and making notes. I'm not talking about how long it takes to write the essay, I'm talking about how long it takes to get ready to write. The reading, rereading, the gathering information, all that takes a lot of time. But you should have been doing that during the class already. I mean, some of that work should already be done, right? Because you've been gathering information from class lectures, from the reading you're doing, from your studying for exams and other assignments. A really good essay assignment is always a natural extension of the class that you're taking. You use the essay assignment to respond directly to some question or issue that's come up during the class. So it's at least partially based on stuff you've already learned in the class, and that gives you a small body of knowledge to start with. It can start you a little bit ahead of the game there. So once you've gathered a lot of information about your topic, then you can start writing about it. But let me tell you, there is a mandatory sequence of steps for writing out your ideas and turning your ideas into an essay. And there are 3 major mandatory steps. And if you try to skip any of them, you're not going to do well. So we're going to walk through these one at a time. The first major step in writing is an outline. Writing an outline is crucial to success. People who don't outline before they start writing fail at writing more often than not. So how do you write an outline? Well, first, it's a lot easier, I think, than it might sound. You go back to your hypothesis, your idea, reread it. Does it still make sense now that you've gathered more information? If it does, great. If not, well, start rewriting it until it fits the information that you've actually gathered. Your ideas, your opinions might have changed a lot in the research process. Now, you might have to rewrite your hypothesis 2, 3, 4 times. That's okay. Actually, that's really good. When I'm writing, I usually just write a new version of my hypothesis underneath the last one, so I just have a record of how my thoughts have developed. Once you do that, you can start making a point-by-point outline of how you think your idea is going to develop. How are you going to prove your point, or how are you going to explore the issue, or what are the major things that you need to say about it? And it doesn't have to be some fancy outline. It can just be a bulleted list, or maybe a series of 3 or 4 questions and answers. You don't have to try to format it all nicely unless you're just a compulsive organizer and can't help yourself. You knock yourself out. That's you. You just need to list what you want to talk about first, next, and last. And a good outline might be that simple and that short. What you're going to talk about first, what you're going to say next, and what you're going to deal with last. Points 1, 2, and 3. You might have more points than that. You might have 5 or 6 major things that you want to talk about, but for a short essay at least, first, next, and last is a good place to start. Now, each point in your outline is going to be connected with some material you've collected, right? Some facts, a key quotation, a bit of information, some connection that you've made, so you can start filling in the points of your outline with some of that information. try to find a place for everything you've collected. You can always cut things out later. And you may even notice that as you're outlining and plugging bits of information in, that you're starting to write sentences and maybe even having some paragraphs start forming in embryo. Now that's a good thing, but it's not necessary. Outlines do not even have to be written in sentences. Often just words and phrases will do. It's the sequence of ideas, it's the sequence of facts and information that really matters here. Now, there should be some obvious direction to your outline, some clear reason for organizing your thoughts in this way and not in another way. But remember, you can always reorganize your main points later on, so don't get too fussy about organization here. Even bad organization is better than no organization at all. As people who play chess say, even a bad plan is better than no plan at all. You can always change it later. But I have to say, now is the best time to put your information in the best order possible. Now, as a rule, natural order is always better than artificial order. And what I mean is this. If possible, use some kind of chronological order or spatial order. If you're writing, again, some kind of literary analysis, start at the beginning of the material, the beginning of the passage or the poem or the book, and just walk through till the end. Or you start at one side of something and you end at the opposite side. Now, this is really important because if your organization seems random, if it seems arbitrary, your audience is not going to take you seriously. I mean, if they don't see a clear progression of thought in your writing and clear connections between your ideas, they're going to get bored, distracted, confused, probably annoyed, and they'll either stop reading or they'll turn against you, and that's not good. You need to keep your reader walking with you each step of the way. So, the first major step in writing an essay is writing out an outline and starting to fill it up with some facts and information. Now, the second major step in essay writing is what I'm going to call the mind dump. In other words, you take everything that you know or you think about this issue and you dump it into the document. You write out absolutely everything you can possibly think to say about the issue. So, you can start with going back to your hypothesis, your idea, one more time. And now that you've written an outline, you should have a pretty good idea of whether that hypothesis is going to work or not, about whether you're onto something, about whether or not you're right about the issue, about the question you're trying to answer. Now, if one of the many versions of your hypothesis seems to work, that's great. You can keep it, and at this point, you can probably delete the other versions, the earlier versions that didn't work. But you might need to write out one more version of that hypothesis just to fit the facts that you've found. Now, you may also have discovered when you were outlining that you don't have as much proof of an idea as you thought you did. Or you might find that you have a lot more material on one subtopic than you thought, so you're going to have to write out that hypothesis, write out a different hypothesis maybe, or a different version that reflects the information that you actually have, not just what you wish you'd found. Well, anyway, back to the mind dump. Go back to the outline itself. For each point on the outline, write down everything you can think of, everything you know about the issue. And at this point, you are not worried about saying things well or clearly or persuasively. The goal is just to get words on paper. So, be wordy. Be repetitious. Say the same thing in more than one way. Do not worry too much about wording, grammar, consistency, or formatting at this point at all. Words on paper is what we're looking for. But you should pause to put in citations or references for material that you've gotten from other sources. They don't have to be full references, but enough that you can put together a whole citation from your notes later on. Because there's nothing worse than coming back to a draft and finding a really wonderful quote or a key fact and then having no idea where you got it from. Because at that point, you either have to do a lot of searching and waste some time looking for that source again, or you just have to scrap that point so you don't plagiarize. Well, during that mind dump, assume that you're going to do a lot of editing and rewriting later, and that you're going to throw away a lot of what you're writing at this point. And that means you need to write more than you're actually going to have in the final essay. Probably 25 to 50% more. Your draft should be 25 to 50% longer than the final essay. So for a 3-page essay, you plan to write out 4 to 6 pages, at least. For a 10-page paper, writing out 15 pages of material is good. Now, your ability to put that much on paper is directly connected with how much time and effort you've put into learning about your topic in the first place. If you haven't done enough reading, enough research, enough gathering of information, you simply won't be able to do this. So if your mind dump produces a document that's too short, then you don't need more words. What you need to do is go back and gather more information so you have more to say. The result of this mind dump is called a draft. It's not a good essay yet. Looks kind of like an essay, but it's something. And something is a whole lot better than nothing. But if that draft is under the maximum allowable word count, I know that the temptation, right, is just to turn it in as is. Forget about it. Please don't do that. Please don't just turn in a mind dump. The difference between a mediocre writer and a good writer is that the mediocre writer just stops with that mind dump, with the draft. But the draft isn't even an essay yet most of the time. It's just an outline with a mind dump. There's real information there. There's maybe even some real thought, but it's cluttered, it's muddy, it's unclear, it's repetitious, or maybe it's just so formulaic and superficial that it doesn't really offer any genuine insight on the issue. A lot of mediocre writers see their task as just filling up an outline with seemingly relevant words and calling that an essay. But just because you have an outline doesn't mean your argument is strong. The outline makes the essay stand up, like a skeleton does with a body. But even if the bones of the body are strong, the flesh on the bones can still be weak or undeveloped and vulnerable to attack, or the flesh on the bones might be flabby and bloated and unattractive. Well, you want your body to be healthy flesh on healthy bones. You want your essay to be strong ideas and facts supported by a durable structure, the outline. Okay, so you have a draft. It's not good, but it's a draft. It's words on paper, which is what you needed. Now, before you go any farther, go back to your hypothesis, your idea, one more time. Does it still make sense? It's important to ask yourself that because your original hypothesis may not have really gotten proved in the course of the mind dump. You might have shifted your focus or begun to answer a different question than the one you first had in mind. If you look back at your hypothesis and see that it doesn't match the bulk of what you've written, then you have two options. You can either trash the whole draft and rewrite it to answer your original hypothesis, or you can rewrite the hypothesis to reflect what you've actually discovered in your writing. And let me tell you that the second option is always the right choice. Always rewrite your hypothesis to fit your information, to fit your draft. Don't try to rewrite your draft to fit a hypothesis that you couldn't prove. Now, before you do anything else, there's one very important thing that you absolutely must do if you want your writing to be good. And that is, do nothing with your draft for at least a day. Yeah, go do something else for a while. Forget about what you've written. Take a break. That way, you can go back to your writing and evaluate your work honestly. Taking at least a 24-hour break from writing is ideal. 48 hours, even better. But you should at least sleep on it. So put aside your writing overnight and then come back to it fresh the next day. Now, you did start this whole writing process well ahead of the due date, so you could actually have time for this, right? Yeah, because if you just started writing the night before the paper's due, what you're going to turn in is a rough draft, not a real essay. Now, it may be the professor is actually okay with getting a rough draft, but you shouldn't be okay with that. You're going to be surprised at how many errors you're going to catch once you come back to your writing just a day later. Okay, so the first two stages of essay writing were the outline and the mind dump, also known as drafting, writing the rough draft. The third stage is just as important. It's rewriting, revising, and editing. Because now is the time to do a lot of deleting, a lot of cutting and pasting, a lot of revising, a lot of rewriting. As you begin to edit your draft, there are 3 levels at which you're going to edit your paper. And you're going to start from the biggest and go down to the smallest. So you start with a paragraph level. You deal with paragraphs, then you go to the sentence level, and then you deal with the level of individual words. So if possible, you need to edit in that order. So you start by asking yourself, One, are the paragraphs in the right order? Those large blocks of thought need to have a logical sequence. Now, because you wrote an outline, they should already be in some kind of order, right? But are they in the best order? Would a different order be more effective for leading your audience step by step from one idea to the next? You will probably also find that some paragraphs just don't belong in the essay. They need to be thrown out entirely. Maybe you went off on a tangent somewhere and the essay is getting off track. No problem. If you wrote too much to begin with, you have material to burn. You can just throw out that irrelevant material without being afraid of coming up short in the end. Now, I don't like throwing out material personally, so I usually keep a separate document that I can put the cut material in, just in case I need to put it back into the essay at some point later on. I never actually do, but it just makes me feel better about cutting material out, so I put that all in a different document. You might think too, while you're dealing with paragraphs, about how long your paragraphs are. Here's a good rule of thumb when it comes to paragraph length. You should be able to fit 1 or 2 paragraphs on one double-spaced page, or 3 or 4 paragraphs on one single-spaced page. Now, paragraphing is a visual thing. Your reader's eyes need visual breaks that are regular but not too frequent. In a college-level essay, you should never have more than 2 paragraph breaks on a single double-spaced page. But you also shouldn't have any full pages that have no paragraph breaks at all. 1 or 2 paragraph breaks per double-spaced page is just about perfect. So once you get the paragraphs in the right order, then you have to ask yourself, are the sentences in the right order? A paragraph should begin with a topic sentence. And a topic sentence does 2 things, always. First of all, the topic sentence serves as a transition from the point you just finished making to the point that you're about to make. Transitions always go at the beginning of paragraphs, not at the end. The second thing a topic sentence needs to do is it has to clearly lay out the point you're about to make in this paragraph that you're beginning. So, you've identified your topic sentence, you've put it at the beginning of the paragraph. Now your paragraph needs to move back and forth between general observations and specific details, and it needs to do this a couple of times. A really strong paragraph will have 2 or 3 compelling pieces of information in it. A quotation, a fact, a logical deduction, something like that. And then 2 or 3 of those things linked together should lead to a conclusive statement at the end of a paragraph. Now, this is the time to get vicious with your work. As you were doing your mind dump, you were being repetitious, you were saying the same thing in more than one way. Well, now it's time to cut. Cut out redundant sentences. Every sentence should be doing new work. Every sentence should either be giving us a new piece of information or telling us what that information means. Now, some paragraphs will end up being too short because you've cut out all the unnecessary stuff. Well, you can always combine really short paragraphs with each other or with other paragraphs, or you can just cut them out altogether if they don't absolutely need to be there. And once you've looked at the sentences, we've looked at the paragraphs and tried to get them in the right order, we've looked at the sentences within each paragraph and gotten them in the right order. Now it's time to get serious about individual words. Ask yourself, are the words the right words? We tend to use vague, general words when we should be using precise and specific ones. We often use complicated, wordy sentences when we really could be writing in sentences that are simple and direct. So cut sentences down to their barest essentials. Cut out phrases that don't really add anything. Replace whole phrases with single words whenever you can. Cut out qualifying language like maybe or perhaps. Replace big words with small words. And by the way, when it comes to words, don't use words that you wouldn't ever use in a conversation. Because if you wouldn't ever use that word in a conversation, then you probably don't actually know what it means. I mean, even the technical language from the class, the technical jargon, should be natural to you by now. You might not use it in a conversation, with your intimate friends over a text message, but you might use it in a conversation with a professor or with an intelligent classmate or maybe with a prospective employer. Now, it sometimes helps to print the essay off at this point and start marking it up by hand, which is what I usually do. As you read your draft, ask yourself, is every word exactly the right word to convey your meaning at this point? Are you hanging on to anything just because you think it's clever or because you like a certain turn of phrase? Yeah, get rid of those especially. Kill your darlings, as writers like to say. Rewrite ruthlessly. Short and simple is always better than long and complicated, because you can always combine short sentences for variety later on if you like. In other words, every word should make a clear and direct contribution to proving your hypothesis. Now, if you are really struggling with editing at this level, if you're really struggling with writing clear sentences and getting the wording just perfect, here are a couple of ideas that might help you see where you're being wordy and unclear and how to fix it. The first one is this. Try rereading the essay, but read it backwards. Read it backwards sentence by sentence. Start at the last page with the last sentence, and then read that, and then read the sentence before that, and then one before that. That decontextualizes the sentence. It breaks the flow of your thinking so that you can see that sentence in isolation. You're going to catch sentences that are wordy or unclear or that contain grammatical errors that way. It's amazing how well that works. But if you're still struggling with putting together effective sentences, try this. Try, for every sentence that you write 2 or 3 different versions of that sentence below it. Then choose the one that seems clearest or best to you. Now, this is time intensive, but as an exercise, it helps a lot, especially if you really struggle to write clear sentences. So if everything works out, your essay should be pretty close to the target length here. But it's still not a draft of an essay. It's still just a draft. I mean, it's not a genuine essay. It's not a full essay just yet. You'll notice that we've been focusing exclusively on the body of the essay. So what about the introduction? What about the conclusion? Did I skip something? No, I didn't skip them. You write your conclusion and your introduction last. You don't write your introduction first. You write your introduction and your conclusion last. That may be counterintuitive, but think about it for a minute. I think you'll figure it out. Because right now, all you have for an introduction is your hypothesis, or probably several different versions of your hypothesis. But now that you have something that looks like a real essay, you have a really good idea of what you have to introduce. So now, you introduce it. The introduction, by the way, doesn't begin with the first sentence. It begins with the title of the essay. That's your first impression, and you shouldn't waste that opportunity to make a first impression. What I'm telling you to do here is write a real title, not some idiocy like English essay number 1. Oh gosh, I hate that. Anyway, write a real title. Now, a real title, a good title, might just be your hypothesis reduced to a phrase. That works great. Now, you can be clever in your title, you can be clever and attention-grabbing in your opening sentence if you really want to. That's okay. But whatever you do, please be technically correct. A factual error, a grammar error in the opening sentence is a total deal killer. You will lose your audience before you've begun. So go over that first sentence and that title again and again until they're perfect. You don't have to do that with every sentence in an essay, but you do need to do that with your first sentence, and probably your last sentence too. Now, in the introduction, do tell us briefly what topic or issue you're dealing with. We need to know that. I mean, your answer won't make any sense to us if we don't know what the question is. Don't make us play Jeopardy with your essay here. Remind us of any crucial context, but don't spend a lot of time on contextual stuff. The introduction needs to get to the main point as efficiently as possible. And your main point is the hypothesis that you've been working with all along. But now we're going to quit calling it a hypothesis because it's turned into a thesis. So take off the hypo and you have a thesis, or as we like to call it, a thesis statement. Your thesis statement traditionally comes at the end of your first paragraph, at the end of your introduction. That's where your readers are going to expect to see it, so unless your professor told you to put it somewhere else, just put it at the end of your introductory paragraph. This is the point that your whole essay is setting out to prove, your thesis statement. It's the main focus of the whole essay, so double and triple check the thesis statement to make sure that it's clear, that it's precise, and please that it's grammatically correct. Okay, so much for the introduction. What about the conclusion? There is a template for a good introduction. There's an opening sentence, there's context, and then there's the thesis statement. There's the question and the answer. It's a pretty clear template for writing a good introduction. So what about the conclusion? Is there a template for writing a good conclusion? No, there isn't. Sorry, there really isn't. There is no standard practice for organizing an effective conclusion. I can tell you, however, what not to put into it. The last paragraph of your essay should not just restate all the things you've said before. It should not just repeat your main points in your thesis statement. It's boring. It's also condescending. I mean, trust your readers to remember what you just said 2 or 3 pages ago. Trust their intelligence. Okay, so if you shouldn't repeat your main points in the conclusion, what should you do? Well, I can't tell you. Sorry, but every situation is unique. Your conclusion should, however, sum up what you've discovered in the process of writing. So when you're trying to write a conclusion, ask yourself some questions. Ask yourself, what does this all add up to? I mean, what's the big takeaway from this essay? What do you want your readers to especially remember? Is there something that you've been implying all along that you can now make explicit? I mean, what's the next logical step after your thesis statement is proved? And why does your thesis statement matter anyway? I mean, why does this issue matter? Who cares? What does it all signify? The conclusion is your opportunity to really get philosophical about your topic, to ask yourself why things are the way they are and why they really matter. So if you like to get philosophical about things, your conclusion is the right place to do that. Well, now that you've edited every paragraph of your essay, introduction, your body paragraphs, and your conclusion, you're almost done. There are just 3 little steps to take if you really want to make this whole essay worthwhile. So here they are. Step number 1, read the essay out loud from beginning to end without stopping. You can read it to somebody else if you're not too self-conscious about that. Actually, even if you are too self-conscious about it, do it anyway. It's good for you. Or you can just read it to yourself too, but read it out loud in a regular speaking voice. You're going to catch things that you need to fix, from typos, grammar errors, to wordy and awkward constructions. So read the essay out loud from beginning to end, pen in hand, ready to make corrections. I find that printing out a paper draft at this point is really, really helpful. Oh, by the way, this is a great time to get somebody else to read your essay and help you look for any trouble spots, like I just said. Even someone who's not an awesome writer can help you spot awkward transitions, unclear statements, or anything that just doesn't make as much sense as you think it does. A second pair of eyes is incredibly valuable at this stage, if only for helping you to spot mechanical errors or missing citations or typos or inconsistencies. So get someone else to help you reread this essay. All right, so the next thing to do is to go back over your essay one more time to double check your source citations. Because you're writing from information that you've gathered and not just off the top of your own head, you're probably going to have to credit some information to your sources. Tell us where you found your information. So you need to make sure that every piece of information includes a clear citation in whatever format or source citation style you happen to be using. Look closely at every entry on the bibliography or the works cited page. Make sure there's no missing information. Make sure that the formatting is absolutely consistent. And then finally, you can do all the little formatting tasks. You can add a heading or a title page, whatever's appropriate. You can add page numbers. You can check margins and spacing and all the rest. I always draft my essays in single space and then double space the document at the very end. That way I can see more of my work on the screen at one time as I'm writing. Other people like to start out double spaced from the beginning. Again, do whatever works for you. So, once you've read the essay out loud, you've checked the citations, and you've done all the formatting tasks, well, now you have an essay. It's time to upload your essay or print it out and hand it in. If you upload it, you should give it a file name that includes your last name and the name of the class that you wrote it for. File names like English Essay 2 are kind of lame, and they tend to get jumbled sometimes if your professor has to download it onto a personal computer. So yeah, give it a real file name. Now, if you have to submit a paper copy, we old folks like to call it a hard copy, don't forget that it needs to be bound in some way. So unless you really need some fancy folder, binder, or something like that, just staple the document in the upper left-hand corner, because nothing says last-minute panic like a paper handed in without being stapled. So congratulations, your essay is finished, it's turned in. Well, now that you've finished your imaginary essay and turned it in, I want to reflect a little bit on how all this works in the context of a college writing class and what we're really trying to accomplish here. You may have noticed that the process that I've just outlined is pretty complicated, but it doesn't really require you to sit in a lecture class for 2 or 3 days a week. I mean, you could do all of this on your own if you really wanted to, and people do. That's the problem with the whole classroom setup when it comes to writing classes. I love being in the classroom day in and day out with my students, but that's not necessarily the best way for you to learn to write. If I could completely reinvent the college writing class, here's what I might do. At the beginning of the term, we would meet for two or three times in one-on-one sessions just to assess your interests and your skill level in writing, and then after a brief tutorial on gathering information, I would send you off to work by yourself for a couple of weeks, gathering information on a topic that interests you and drafting an essay about it. Then we would regroup and critique your essay, and maybe have you revise it. Then I'd give you another assignment, maybe something a little more complicated or challenging, and we'd do that twice more throughout the semester. And your course grade would be the average of your 2 highest scoring essays, best 2 out of 3. Now, the one problem with that approach is human nature. This ideal approach, as I just described it, assumes that you have some genuine interests and that you are self-motivated and self-disciplined enough to work independently on a multi-stage project with absolutely no accountability until the very end. And I don't know about you, but when I'm working on a complicated multi-stage project, I usually need regular accountability, and you probably do too. Also, it's not all that easy to find worthwhile things that genuinely interest you. I remember having a conversation with a student years ago, and he was having trouble coming up with a topic for a research paper. So I asked him, well, what kind of things are you interested in? Well, he hemmed and hawed for a while, and then he finally said, I like movies. I said, great, you can write about movies. So, he could have written about, the way CGI is changing the industry, or about the decisions that directors have to make while shooting and editing scenes, or he could have written about the copyright laws that affect the distribution of movies. He could have picked a serious film and written about its ethical dimensions or its aesthetic qualities. But as we talked, none of those possibilities seemed to really interest him. As it turned out, I think he was really just interested in watching movies, which means that he was really just interested in being entertained. He ended up, I think, failing the class, if I remember correctly, because he couldn't write a research paper. He could put words on paper, he could put sentences together to form paragraphs, but he just wasn't interested in real things, so he had nothing to write about. I felt really bad for him by the end of it, but I think his case is actually pretty typical. At age 18, most of us have no idea what kinds of things we could be or should be interested in. At that age, we're mostly just interested in ourselves, right? We don't yet know enough about the world we live in to even be interested in things outside ourselves. So, as it turns out, the 2 problems that I started with at the very beginning of this lecture, not knowing stuff and not being motivated, they're directly connected to each other. If we're not motivated to go and learn a lot of stuff, we won't know enough to write something meaningful about that issue, that topic. But if we don't know anything, then there's really nothing there that's going to capture our interest. So we end up just being satisfied with our own self-centered interests. And if you're going to write something that genuinely speaks to other people, which is what an essay should do, you can't be merely self-interested. Readers are going to see right through that. I mean, nobody likes to listen to people who care only about themselves. You don't, and neither does anybody else. So if you're going to write something that speaks to other people, you're going to have to be interested in things other than yourself. This is where formal education comes in. We all have to be coerced a little bit into taking an interest in things outside of ourselves. I mean, formal education forces you to pay attention to things that you might have otherwise ignored. Hopefully to things that are true and good and even beautiful, things that are really important, maybe in a permanent or even an eternal sense. So what higher education does is it takes your self-centered interests, your desire for career training and the prospect of earning a healthy income, and it harnesses those interests to draw your attention to a much wider field of potential knowledge than you would have ever otherwise encountered. It's a little like your mom making you finish your dinner before you have your dessert. In college we say, hey, it's fine that you want to be trained for a career that will make you a lot of money, but first you need to become the kind of person who can handle that kind of responsibility. Somebody who's capable of recognizing, thinking about what's true and good and beautiful, not just about how to make more and more money. You need to become the kind of person who can handle that responsibility. So, in a typical English class, the way things are set up now, we oftentimes give you literature to write about. The idea is that we all read something important together and then we write about it individually. There's some advantages to this approach. It levels the playing field. I mean, as long as everybody is doing the reading, everybody has about the same amount of knowledge to start out with, and those people who come into the class knowing not a lot about other stuff, they're not at a complete disadvantage when they start writing. And those who come into class knowing a lot about other things still have to do some mental work in order to gain enough knowledge to write the essay. They don't just breeze through. So the playing field gets leveled with the literature, at least a little bit. The other advantage of writing about literature is that literature is like life, but simpler. Literature is easier to deal with than real life because there are fewer variables, right? There's a pre-packaged set of questions that you can ask about literature. There are also, most unfortunately, pre-packaged sets of answers to those questions, hence all of the homework helps like SparkNotes, bane of my existence, don't get me started. But there are also some disadvantages to writing about literature. The main one is that not everybody cares about the literature. And of course, not everybody is going to care about this literature in this class, even if they happen to like the other kinds of literature in other classes. Not every piece of literature is to everybody's taste. So, even though writing about literature can solve the knowledge problem, it doesn't always solve the motivation problem, the interest problem. Now, it would be better in one sense if writing weren't taught by English faculty at all, but by everybody who teaches college courses. I mean, shoot, let a biologist teach you how to write about biology. Let a psychologist teach you how to write about psychology. Let a philosopher teach you how to write about philosophy. It would make sense, too, because writing in different disciplines is different. You don't write the same way in the hard sciences as you do in the humanities. Each discipline does have its own expectations, its own literary style, you might say, as well as its own formatting guidelines. Also, good faculty do a lot of writing anyway. You can't get very far in your career as a professor if you're a totally incompetent writer, any more than if you're a totally incompetent speaker. So, yeah, it would be ideal if you just took writing classes taught by faculty in your individual major. And some universities do actually have other upper-level courses in discipline-specific writing. They're taught by faculty in that discipline. And yet, most professors in disciplines outside English are not actually very comfortable teaching people how to write. Being able to do something well is not the same thing as being able to teach others how to do it well. Doing and teaching are always two different skill sets. It's true that any competent professors should be able to give you some suggestions to improve your writing in their field of study. But no matter how awesome they are in their own field, they may actually struggle to articulate to you the fundamentals of good writing, especially if they themselves learned the fundamentals a long time ago. Because we forget what it's like to be beginners. And It's actually harder for exceptionally talented people to teach other people their skills because it comes easy to them. They don't know what it's like to struggle with the basics like most of us do. So, for better or worse, in college, you're stuck with learning to write from people who study literature. Well, that brings us back to the nature of this particular college course, freshman English composition. This semester, what I'm trying to do is draw your attention to some potentially interesting things that you might not know a lot about yet, things you don't already have a strong opinion about, things that will raise some genuine questions, the kinds of things that might set you writing. I'm aiming to give you a new set of things that I hope will spark your curiosity, at least enough to write something meaningful about them. Thanks for listening. This is Dr. Stephen Schuler, Professor of English at University of Mobile.